Thank you. All right, how's everyone doing? Oh, that was the most subdued response ever. Come on, I know it's 100 elite people, but how are you doing? Yes, yes. Gusto. It's even Friday, so let's get fired up here. I'm going to slide advance a little bit, and then we're gonna get in. So a little quick housekeeping. I know for those of you that are looking for Wi-Fi, it's a Hotel Nico is the network. The password is Glassdoor 24, all lowercase. So get in the Wi-Fi and have some fun. Hey, there I am. All right. So first off, I want to thank Robert and the Glassdoor team for inviting all of us here. This is a great first-of-its-kind event. You are all pioneers for taking place, so thanks for taking time to schedules. I know that we have over 5,000 people streaming virtually, so we're really thankful and grateful for that attendance. So who's tuned in virtually, we're glad to have you here. We've got a great schedule for all of you today. We have some of the leading minds in employer branding, fellow employer branding nerds like myself, and they're going to be sharing some tips and secrets that they utilize at organizations like Zappos and AT&T and Glassdoor and Deloitte. Some really special stories around how we're all using employer branding. And I think that's an important part. As Robert mentioned, employer branding as a discipline is really something that has been gaining a lot of momentum right now. And what that means is it's still a fairly new field. All of us who are heavily involved in employer branding, we're all working to figure it out as we go. There's no playbook. So that's part of the fun in doing what we do is you get to experiment and tinker and try to figure out different ways to bring visibility and awareness for your organization. And we're going to walk you through a lot of that today. So we've got a tremendous lineup of speakers for you today, as you can see here. And each of them has a unique story to bring to you around the field of employer branding. So we're really excited about that. If you are tweeting, we're going to get to hashtags in a second, so hopefully you are. I imagine everybody in this room pretty much is tweeting, right? Come on, it's an employer branding conference, so let's hope so. It's going to be pretty full, so we're going to do a series of interspersed between. So we'll typically have 3 speakers running together and then a bit of a break. So as Allison mentioned, for those of you that are in the room, because we're live streaming, try to stay in your seats. Those breaks will come, I promise. And for those of you that are following us along virtually, you can jump in and jump out as often as you want, and we will be making video of these presentations available after the fact. So if you have to jump out to a meeting and miss part of this, you'll be able to catch it on video afterwards. I mentioned Twitter. Your hashtag of the day is GD Summit. So that's the core hashtag for the event. If you're tweeting about what people are talking about, if you're tweeting about what's interesting to you, use the hashtag GD Summit. As I mentioned, there's over 5,000 people streaming with us virtually. So we do want to make this as interactive as possible for them. So we've actually introduced a second hashtag called Ask GD Summit. So Ask GD Summit is primarily for the virtual audience. If you have a question for any of our speakers, tweet us using the Ask GD Summit hashtag, and the social media team from Glassdoor is going to be reviewing those tweets, and we're going to do our best to actually incorporate a couple of those tweets into the Q&A for each speaker at the end of the session. So Ask GD Summit, that is your Twitter housekeeping. So with that, I want to jump into my session to get things started. And for those of you that do know me, I've been working in recruiting for over 15 years. I'm really passionate about the field of employer branding, and I want to kind of walk you through a bit of that journey. But the premise of my talk is really that I think recruiting as a whole has not evolved to the level that we need to be. We are still operating in fairly antiquated processes, practices, and procedures that really isn't keeping up with society at large. So I want to walk you through a vision of what recruiting might look like if we built it today. So for me, my journey started in 2010 towards employer branding. I was a freshly minted Senior Director of Talent Acquisition and Innovation at NPR in DC. And it was my second week on the job. I was fired up. I had that, that new guy enthusiasm. I'm walking to my office, and I walk past our intern's desk. And I look in to say hi like I usually do, but I can't see her. And I can't see her because there's a mountain of paper covering her desk. And so I'm confused by this, and I say, hey, good morning, and what's with the paper? This is really bizarre. Her response terrified me. It was 950 faxed applications and cover letters for our summer internship program. Let that sink in for a moment. 950 applications and cover letters. So I said, okay, great. I walked into my office. I closed the door. I sighed deeply. And I said, okay, to me, that was a great reminder that as a whole, our practices have really not fully kept up. We're still faxing applications, and this wasn't that long ago. So at NPR, I sat out. That was right around the time I was beginning to develop our talent strategy. And for us, we had some unique challenges. We were a nonprofit. We were competing against for-profits pretty much everywhere we worked, whether it was journalism, whether it was technology. We were recruiting against tons of for-profits. And as a nonprofit, we were pretty lean. We didn't have a lot of budget. We didn't have a lot of resources. I had come from a traditional recruiting background. I had run global recruiting at Ticketmaster. I'd worked at some startups. A traditional approach wasn't going to work for us. And so for me, it was a matter of saying, okay, what do? We've got a great consumer base. We've got a great fan affinity. We've got employees that are pretty hip to social media and technology. Let's flip this. Let's actually build a strategy around putting our employees first and really leading with our employer brand. And that was kind of my big realization, that recruiting can change. It can be different. It doesn't have to be transactional. And so the results are pretty well documented. We saved over $100,000 a year in job boards. Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn were all in our top 10 sources of hires and applicants. And Twitter was our number 4 source of hire. I know we have Twitter in the room today, right? Yes, okay. Applause in the back. So yes, thank you, Anitra. We're all big Twitter fans here. But number 4 source of hire, that was huge. And that really opened my mind up to new ways of doing things. And so that led me to ask the question, what if? What if we reapproached recruiting in a new way? What if we kind of shook off the shackles of this legacy process that we've been working under for years and tried to approach recruiting differently and leading with an employer brand? And I think for me, many people in this room, we're friends with a lot of people that are kind of futurists in recruiting, and we talk about things like gamification and the Tindering and Uberizing of recruiting and all these advanced concepts, and that's great. But the reality is most organizations are not ready for that. Most organizations are still dealing with faxed applications. Many organizations are still dealing with emails as an ATS. How many of you compiled your global headcount reports on Excel recently? We're not quite ready. There are some companies that are way far over there, and that's great. They're doing amazing work. But as a whole, we're not ready. And so what I want to do is I want to paint a picture of what recruiting might look like that's actually feasible if we built it from the ground up today. So this is recruiting. Say hello to recruiting. For those of you that know me, you'll know that I recently became a father. So the idea of recruiting, to me, it's like when you have a baby, there's infinite possibilities. You don't know what it's going to be when it grows up. There's no bias. It can become anything. And so recruiting in this model is that. It's a fresh start. We have no legacy. And what might it look like if we're starting now? And so there's a variety of things that I think we have to think about. First off, it's generational. We have 3 generations in the workplace today. By 2020, we're going to have 5 generations, all in the workplace, from boomers to Gen Z. Kind of scares me to say that, but yes, all of those generations at once. So think about this. We all have different habits. It wasn't that long ago when we were taking want ads in the newspaper to advertise our jobs. It wasn't that long ago when all we had was a phone. Many recruiters still primarily use their phone. A phone is still probably our best tool in our recruiting tool belt. But we've got a lot more. We've got these. We have smartphones. We have smart watches. We have all kinds of technology now that's changing how we can go about recruiting. And I think, for me, one of the biggest generational impacts on that is the emergence of Gen Y and how they are taking a larger position in the workforce. So with Gen Y, 47% of the labor force right now is Gen Y. According to SHRM, 50% of the labor market will be Gen Y next year. By 2025, 75% of the labor force will be the quote-unquote social media generation. These are all people who grew up with social media. They grew up with real-time information and access to individuals and companies. Their habits are very different than boomers. Their habits are very different than even Gen X. And so as we're developing our recruiting process now, we really need to take this into consideration. How are some of the ways that we can reach all the different people that we're recruiting? And we talk a lot about the different tools that we use, and one that we talk a lot about is social media. So social media is a great resource in your employer branding efforts. Social media itself is not a strategy. Social media is a tool. And I think in recruiting, especially those who are new to figuring out how to use social media, they get crossed up and hung up on that a little bit. They think, I tweeted my job. I do social recruiting. Yay! Social recruiting is not tweeting jobs. Social media is a distribution method for your employer branding efforts. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to frame social media more along the lines of employer branding rather than social sourcing and some of the other ways you can utilize social media. So think about it. We've got almost half of our workforce grew up in a social media environment with social media generation. That's massive. And people are using social media in new ways. They're using social media to find jobs. And I would argue smart organizations are using social media not to amplify their jobs, but to build community and to build engagement. They're providing value. That's how you win at social media for a social recruiting standpoint. You provide value to your audience. You don't spam them with jobs. You provide them with looks inside your organization. You provide them with articles and trends and white papers and news about your organization, your industry. Smart companies that are really getting social are using social to develop highly targeted outreach and engagement and content marketing programs to get into the specific communities where they recruit. So that's really how we should be looking at social. It's not about are we tweeting our jobs. It's about are we building an engaged audience, an engaged community that can really extend our reach. And there's a lot of pushback when people talk about social media in smaller companies. If I don't have a brand name like Nike or Adidas or Pepsi, how am I going to use social? And I would push back on that. I would say, actually, for smaller organizations, social is exactly what you need because social levels the playing field. You don't have to have a huge budget to be successful in social. You have to have a will, you have to have a curiosity, you have to have time, but you don't need a huge budget. The idea of a small mom and pop shop in Des Moines that can build a really engaged audience on Twitter or Facebook or whatever channel they choose, now that amplifies their reach. It allows them to take them out of that small market and have now global access to the global talent pool. And that's not something that you had through traditional recruiting methods even 5 years ago. So I would challenge you to reframe how you look at social in that context. And I think when you talk about social, you can't do it without also talking about mobile. So mobile and social, to me, go hand in hand. I imagine everybody in this room has one of these. I imagine some of you may have two. Hopefully, we've all beyond having them on a holster on our hip. If you do, no judgment, that's fine. But the reality is, if you've got a strong social strategy, people are consuming that content in different places. They're not always doing it at their desktop. They might be at a meeting. They might be in a boring meeting and looking down and checking Twitter because, like, oh my God, is this another meeting today? They might be at lunch. They might be in the bathroom. That's fine. Consume your social media wherever you want. But the reality is, they're not always going to be at their desktop. So if you've done that first step, you've built an engaged community around social, people are interacting with your accounts, you're providing value to them, they might get those tweets on a mobile device. And again, if you've got that engaged community, they're sharing your content. And occasionally you are tweeting jobs, and they are sharing those jobs. And if I'm that job seeker and I get that tweet, and I click on it, whether I'm in the bathroom or lunch or a meeting, and it takes me to a career site that's not optimized for mobile, what am I going to do? Am I really going to pinch and zoom around and check that out? If I get a job and it looks like a great job and maybe I just got out of a rough meeting and I'm like, you know what, now's the time, I'd be open to a recruiting call, and I click that link and it takes me to a job description that's not optimized for mobile, do you think I'm going to stick through that and apply? I'm going to bounce. And so that's the idea. If you're building recruiting from scratch today, you need to have a mobile layer that works. And again, I think the stats say that 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies do not allow for mobile apply. There's a big disconnect in how we're building our recruiting operations and the habits and wants and needs of the people we're trying to recruit. So while we talk about social and we talk about mobile, that goes hand in hand when we talk about employer branding with transparency. Transparency is a buzzword that we talk a lot about in recruiting. How many of you have used the word transparency in the last week? Okay, for those of you virtually, that's most of the room. Transparency, if we're honest with ourselves, is aspirational. How many organizations can you say are truly transparent? Very few come to mind. Buffer might be one, where they recently published all their employees' salaries, and every aspect of their company is open. That's not going to work for most companies. So the idea that we all want to be transparency, I think striving for transparency is a great thing. But I might reframe it a bit and say, why don't we talk about translucency? Translucency is an idea where you can look into that organization and you can get a good sense of what the culture is like, and the people are like, and the work environment is like, and get a sense of whether that's for you. And I think in recruiting, we often talk about employer branding from a talent attraction standpoint. And while that's a big thing that we try to do, we try getting people interested in our organization, it's just as important to have people be able to self-select whether they are right for that organization and that culture or not. On average, 51% of new hires have buyer's remorse after 6 months, according to some Glassdoor figures. And of those, 88% are going to be looking to make a move based on that. Think about that for a minute. We spend a lot of time recruiting great talent into our organizations. If there's a disconnect between what we're selling them and the reality on the ground, they're not going to stick around. They're going to leave. Talent is much more fluid these days. People aren't looking for a silver watch. Retirement after 20 years is not the goal for most employees today. So, they're going to leave. They're not going to stick around in an environment where they're not feeling fulfilled or they don't feel they fit. So why not do a better job of being translucent about what our organizations really offer? And as we talk about the culture, another piece that's really important to talk about is job descriptions. Job descriptions, is there anything that's evolved less in 10 years? I mean, I'm serious. Job descriptions are terrible. They're a laundry list of responsibilities and qualifications that are unrealistic. They're driven largely for compliance purposes, not for actually telling our story to candidate. We can do better. We should do better. And I want to kind of present an idea of what a job description might look like. What if we reframe job descriptions a little bit? We have the ability to embed video. That's not that hard. This is a YouTube video on a desktop. Cheesy. This is my a home office, so I didn't decorate with the super decor in the background, but I wanted to just use this to give an example. We talk about and we tell candidates about your responsibilities and your qualifications. We don't tell them about things that really matter to them. What is your year one deliverables? What are you going to do in your first year if you work here? How are we measuring your success? How are we actually grading your performance? How are we looking at whether you were successful or not in this environment? And what is your growth plan? We bring people in, we pride ourselves on looking for the best and top tier talent, yet oftentimes in the recruiting process, we don't talk about these things. We don't. We just give them this boilerplate job description. And so I would challenge us to think a bit differently. If I'm a software engineer in the Valley here, and I'm good at what I do, I've got tons of options. And in all of those companies, my day-to-day may not differ dramatically. I'm coding, I'm checking for bugs, I'm sitting in on Scrum meetings, I'm doing all those things. What will differ are these three things. What will differ are my perks. What do you offer me? Maybe in the Valley differs a little less because it's so competitive here and everybody has to come out with you a smorgasbord of perks to be competitive. But why don't we show them things like their desk? Here's where you're going to sit. Here's our work environment. And in the spirit of transparency, if you work at Amplify Talent, that's not actually your view. I'm sorry. I know you probably can't see in the back, but it's a gorgeous view out of Skyrise. That's not us. What I can promise you is you will have an opportunity to work with our Chief Bark Officer, Muggsy Barkowitz. So why not share that? Share information about their team. Share their new team's social links. Allow them to engage and see what those people might be working like. And while we're at it, another thing that we do in recruiting quite a bit is we get really hung up on this notion of active and passive talent. I got to find passive talent. Passive talent is like the gold mine of talent in many organizations' minds. Why is that? Is somebody who is not looking infinitely better than somebody who is? Again, we talked about behaviors are changing. People are not feeling married to organizations for any given time. They're much more mobile and open to switching jobs. So this idea that somebody is active, according to Glassdoor's figures, 71% of the labor market is open to a new job at any given time. And I would argue if you've got a really strong employer brand strategy, it's not about active and passive. everybody is a prospect. The universe is a prospect. Anybody is somebody that you may ultimately hire in your organization. And so if you have a really targeted social and employer branding strategy that's identifying what communities you need to recruit in, you've got a great content marketing strategy to penetrate those communities, every one of those people is a prospect. And if you do a good job of engaging them, you can then bring them in so they then become an applicant. And that's really the funnel. It's prospect to applicant to ultimately candidate. That's where we want to push people. I don't think it really matters as much whether somebody's actively or passively looking for a job. And while we're talking about things that we want to build into into our recruiting process, I think we have a legacy of being so heads down in our work in recruiting that as the world evolves and as new technologies and new trends start to emerge, we're not really seeing them. We're focused on our rec load. We're focused on all the operational and kind of tactical aspects of our jobs that by the time something like Google Glass becomes mainstream, and I don't know if it will, but I think wearables are going to have a profound impact on the workplace, we're not aware of it. Now we're playing catch up again. And that brings me to my last point, is that I think oftentimes in recruiting, we tend to be pretty rigid. And we don't do a great job of being forward-looking in our efforts. And so what I would challenge is we're looking at creating a vision for what recruiting might look like. Have your structure in place. Have your, you've got your tasks and your projects that you're working on, but make sure that you're leaving some time in your day to pop your head up. Look around. Educate yourself to trends in the marketplace so that you can understand what are some of these things you might be able to bring into your own organization that can help enhance your own recruiting and talent acquisition efforts. So with that, I know we're very close on time, so let me open it up for maybe a couple questions before we wrap up.
Oh, great. And what's your name?
I want to know, do you encourage employees within your own organization to post comments on blogs, Glassdoor, that type of stuff, and do you monitor it? How do you encourage them, coach them in what to post? What do you suggest?
I encourage them to be open. I do. I don't necessarily steer them to places like Glassdoor and say, hey, will you leave a review of how great we are? I mean, if they feel compelled to do that, that's awesome. And hopefully, my job in recruiting and HR is to create an environment that drives our employees to do that. We want them to have such an affinity with the work that they're doing that they feel compelled to leave those kind of comments. I think it is important for a lot of organizations to provide some level of education to your employees around those posts. So like, LinkedIn, for example, companies that I think train their employees on how to create a compelling LinkedIn profile is actually doing a service. Old school mentality is looking at that approach and saying, why do we want our employees to have great LinkedIn profiles? Now they're going to be poached. That's old school thinking. The reality is talent draws talent. People want to work with great people, and people are checking you out. So if I'm going to go for an interview with a company, I'm going to be researching the people I'm interviewing with. And if I can't find anything about them on any social platforms, that doesn't really give me any extra insight into the environment that I'm going into. So I do think that you should provide some level of training. I don't think that you should censor your employees. But again, I think you also have to have a base level health to your culture to really be successful here. Because if your culture is toxic, throw this all away. Focus on your culture. Fix that. Yep.
A question. Okay. Got a couple hands up.
So Lars, I'm a big fan of revamping job descriptions by far, but how would you reconcile the old and the new? Because we have to keep some that are compliant, and ATSs can't take a lot of the visual.
Yeah.
So what suggestions would you have to make that easy for the candidate to understand?
So a couple things. One, an open letter to ATSs. Please allow us to have more rich functionality and media in our job postings. Please. Does everybody agree? Yeah. Yes. Okay, ATSs, get on that. I think you have to work with some of the technology you have. So some ATSs allow a little more of that, some of that don't. What I recommend is you can do because you really have your kind of compliance-driven internal job descriptions and you have external job postings. The external job postings is where I think you have a bit more flexibility in how you're presenting that job to the people you're trying to recruit. So you can do things like create something on Tumblr, create an infographic. At the very least, hopefully your ATS allows you to do hyperlinks inside of job descriptions, so you can at least make those a little more dynamic. You can link out to some of the content that you might not be able to embed directly inside of it. Okay. We have time for one more. Okay, one more. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question.
Yep.
What if you work for a great company that is behind in time for employer branding? How do you get that buy-in? Like, what would you suggest?
All right, so that's actually, so the question was, if you're working for a company that's behind in employer branding, how do you get that buy-in? And today, you're going to get a lot of that. So actually, in the interest of time, I'm not going to give you a direct answer. If you don't get an acceptable answer by the end of the day, come find me and I'll tell you how to do that. But I know almost every session touches on that a little bit. So with that, I want to thank all of you, and I want to bring up our next speaker, Josh Burson. So